Hello guys, thank you so much for coming back to watch another video on my channel. Now Capcom has recently just done a survey of about Resident Evil titles. If you haven't done it, I think it might still be open. You can go on their website. I'll put the link in the description box if I found it. Now in that survey, Capcom specifically asked for the next Resident Evil remake they prefer from Capcom, and obviously Capcom is looking to make more remakes for the previous Resident Evil titles. So in this video, I'll talk about as to why I think Capcom's next remake would be Resident Evil 1 Remake. Let's find out together. Now Resident Evil 1 already had remake treatment in the form of a Resident Evil 1 Remake which came out in 2002, and that remake is literally one of my favorite Resident Evil titles of all time. It perfectly captures of what the Resident Evil 1 title was supposed to be, but it does it better, and it shows you how much that game was important for a Resident Evil franchise. That title brings back the tank control systems which was present in the original Resident Evil titles, but it does it better. It improves on many things on the first game, and there's so many added elements like Lisa which was missing from Resident Evil 1, and it has improved on the original game. That remake stood out on its own and has become one of the most favorite and one of the most popular Resident Evil titles ever. For many people, that game is perfect the way it is, but for modern gamers and for the Resident Evil community, I'm going to discuss as to why I think Capcom would be making another remake for modern gaming consoles. Now before I start the video, if you do like my content and you've been watching my content, do make sure to subscribe because it would help me to make more content for you guys. And the next videos I'm going to be making, it will be more around Resident Evil Code Veronica Remake and potential Resident Evil 5 Remake. So that'll be separate videos which I'll talk about as to why I think these games would have a remake or why they would require a remake treatment. Now if you look at Resident Evil 1 Remake, it goes back to the basics. It is the numerical first title which still hasn't had a modern remake treatment. We got Resident Evil 2 Remake, which is, to be honest, my favorite Resident Evil remake title, and then we have Resident Evil 4 Remake, Resident Evil 3 Remake. But if someone look at it for Resident Evil franchise from the outside, Resident Evil 1 is the only game numerically which hasn't had a proper remake treatment. Now for a lot of gamers out there, that's perfect and they like the tank control systems. However, the gaming has evolved and the gaming controls has been changed. People do like to see modern games with the modern graphics. Now for anyone who's never played a Resident Evil title in their life, it would be hard for them to jump into a Resident Evil title, especially it's Resident Evil 4 or 3 or 2, because they don't know what is going on with the whole Resident Evil franchise. It would be hard for them to grasp who these characters are. Let's look at Resident Evil 8 Village, which introduces to Chris Redfield in the more later stage of his life. Now a lot of gamers who play that game, they don't know who Chris Redfield is, and we don't know his backstory if you never played any Resident Evil titles. So going back to Resident Evil 1 would make sense because it goes back to the very basic concept of what the biohazard was, how the virus started, who this Umbrella Corporation was, and what they did which led to this zombie outbreak in Resident Evil franchise. Now Resident Evil 1 introduces to one of our most fan favorite characters from the Resident Evil franchise. For example, you see Jill Valentine, Chris Redfield, you have Albert Wesker who's the main antagonist in the game. Then you also get to see Rebecca Chambers, Barry Burton. So I think going back to all of these characters which came from the first Resident Evil title, it would make sense for us to go back to and explore more of their story, which let's say was missing for a lot of gamers out there because who's played Resident Evil title, and we don't know if we see these characters popping up in the Resident Evil franchise. For a lot of gamers that might be turning them off because they don't know who these characters are and they can't connect with these characters properly. So it'll make sense if Resident Evil 1 get a proper remake treatment. We'll find out who these characters are, what these characters has been doing, and how these characters are no known to be one of the favourite or fan favourite characters of this Resident Evil franchise. We've seen Albert Wesker's model in Resident Evil 4 Remake at the very end, so I think it would make sense that they are kind of teasing with Albert Wesker, which I'll discuss more. It might be in Resident Evil 5 Remake or Code Veronica Remake, but I think it might go back to the original Resident Evil 1 Remake, because the model we've seen, he looks quite young, so it can fit into the Resident Evil 1 Remake. Now for me personally, Resident Evil 1 Remake is more like an expandable movie where you see all your favourite characters coming into a one package, and I think Resident Evil 1 Remake would allow us to get to know Chris Redfield and all of these characters and their backstories. So if they decided to make further or future remakes, people would be able to buy into these characters. So it'll make sense for anyone who's never played any Resident Evil title to jump on board and understand where these characters and who these characters are. So I think Resident Evil 1 Remake would allow us to get to know all of these fan favorite characters. What Resident Evil 1 does so well, it's the mystery behind that game. That game has a mystery about what actually happened, because if you see and if you play that game and you never played any future Resident Evil titles, you wouldn't know what actually is going on. The game doesn't tell you much until you explore further and you find out deep down in the game that what exactly is going on. The game doesn't reveal to you much about actually what is going on. To be honest, there is briefly anything mentioned at the start of the game. You're left on your own and you explore and you find out who these people are and what exactly is going on. There are so many twists and turns, especially with the Albert Wesker, if you don't know who this character was and then you found out later on in the game. That's the beauty about a horror game, when there is a mystery around it, because when you don't know, you keep searching, you're looking for every piece of information to connect the dots to find out what has caused all of these people to turn into these cannibalistic beasts. So I think with the Resident Evil 1 Remake, they can continue the same mystery especially for a lot of gamers, and they can add more elements to it which are more relevant now with the Resident Evil 8 title, which would make more sense. And I think it will connect all of those games together with the Resident Evil 1 Remake. So I think Resident Evil 1 Remake would be that perfect mystery horror title especially for a lot of new gamers who's never played any Resident Evil title. Now when Resident Evil 1 came out, this was the game which created this genre called survival horror. Resident Evil 1 would be the pure survival horror game we've been asking from Capcom for a long time. Now the game presents you with a very limited supply which you can find throughout the game. You have the choices to make. You can either fight or you can flight, and that's the beauty of a survival horror game, that way it gives you the option. You don't feel that you are a superhero in that game. You have a very limited supply and you need to make careful and very wise decisions. You have inventory management where you have a limited boxes where you can put limited stuff with you, and then you constantly have to backtrack to the save rooms where you find these boxes where you can store the items you don't need to use. This is the reason why, as a lot of the horror games out there, they fail to capture what Resident Evil 1 title did back in the days when it came out, even with the Resident Evil 1 Remake which came out in 2002. Lastly, the puzzles in that game was excellent. It was crafted well. It wasn't too hard for a gamer who loves to play puzzle games, especially like me, and I think that game does puzzles so right because there is a Metroidvania style to it. For me, it's perfect. I love Metroidvania games, and Resident Evil 1 for me was actually a Metroidvania Resident Evil title. Now at the start of the game, it presents you with so many doors. There's a big mansion, but you can't open them because you require keys in order to progress further into the game. And you'll be looking everywhere to find the missing key item, because you know if you don't find that key item, you won't be able to progress further into the game. And that's the perfect way to immerse a player into your game, because a lot of games out there, they try to kind of capture that, but the problem is that they have such a limited systems that they skip past levels that where you don't get to spend much time. You're not looking, you're not exploring, then you don't care for how beautiful the environment is because you're not going to spend much time into it. And that's what Resident Evil 1 does so perfectly well. And that's why you love to spend so much time in that mansion. Most of your game is actually based in that mansion where you're trapped into it. And then the mansion has so many layers that you find further secrets into the game which was missing in the very start of the game. And then you feel how complex that even that small space could be. So for me, these are enough reasons for Capcom to consider making or remaking Resident Evil 1 title, along with Resident Evil Code Veronica and Resident Evil 5 Remake. Also, there is an event happening for Capcom on Monday, which I might do a reaction on it. I think they might announce Resident Evil 1 Remake or Code Veronica Remake, even Resident Evil 5 Remake, but that's just like my wish list. I don't think they'll be announcing anything related to that. I think it would be more like Resident Evil 4 DLC, separate ways, which they haven't announced yet. So what do you guys think? Do you think Capcom should remake Resident Evil 1 Remake, which came out in 2002? Or should they just look at the other Resident Evil titles? Please do let me know in the comment section down below. So that's it for the video. I'll do another title around Resident Evil Code Veronica Remake and Resident Evil 5 Remake. So do make sure to check them out. So until then, look after yourself. Have a good one.